Okay. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Leah Martino, and I'm the Assistant Programming Manager of the Poetry Matters Project. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Giada Biasetti, Associate Professor of Spanish at Augusta University. Giada has a degree in Language Interpretation and Translation and her PhD in Spanish Language and Literature. Giada and her students have been working with the PRA Publishing Company translating Silvana Marconi's book, Sobrevivi, I Survived, from Spanish to English. The book I Survived by Silvana Marconi is an autobiography of her experience with domestic violence. So today I just have a couple of questions to introduce yourself and your project to our community. So firstly, how did you and your students connect with the PRA Publishing for this project?
So the first time I met PRA Publishing and Lucinda Clark in particular was, I think about 3 years ago now, 3 or 4. We were having a writer's weekend and we collaborated with our creative writing program at Augusta University. We're in the same department. So the languages collaborated, and the theme of the writer's weekend was translation this time. And so that's why it included also other languages other than English. Usually they always, every year they have this event and they invite writers from different places and they present. And so it's they have workshops for the creative writing students and for anybody else who wants to join, etc. So Lucinda Clark attended this event and came to a presentation that I had with the Italian author Frank Iodice. We presented on a translation project we worked on. My students were there. She attended the presentation and then she came up and talked to us and wanted to collaborate with us. And we established this professional relationship, a friendship as well. She was so interested in translation. She loved the presentation. So ever since then, I've been working with Lucinda to promote translation in schools as well, and just learning another language also, and our program and our collaboration. So with Frank Iodice and his company, he has, well, it's not a company, it's an organization called Articoli Liberi. And what they do is they publish books that then they actually give out for free in schools.
Oh.
And they distribute them all over the world. So I've worked with him in various projects where my students do either translations from Spanish into English or English into Spanish, or even at some point Italian to Spanish and then Spanish to English. So we've been doing a lot of translation work, and then thanks to him, we and also PRA publisher, we've been able to publish this work as well, and also present it in schools in the Augusta community. We go around, whenever I was invited to various schools, even in South Carolina. And I brought some of these books, the translations my students made, and I distributed them for free while presenting on our project, and also just the importance of learning another language and translation in general. And so with her, before COVID hit, we were actually going to various schools to present our collaboration and our work together. And thanks to Lucinda, I was able to reach out to various communities and various other students, maybe even kind of recruit students to come and study at Augusta University as well and join our program. And so ever since then, I mean, we've had this working relationship. Then unfortunately COVID hit, so that kind of stalled our ability to be able to travel or go elsewhere and present our work and our books and distribute them for free. But now we're working together again, and with this Uruguayan author who kindly gave us her book to be able to translate it from Spanish into English. So Silvana Marconi is the author we're working on with now. Her book, Sobrevivi, is going to be translated into English, and then PRA Publishing is going to publish it and distribute it then also with the help of Articoli Liberi, distributed it also elsewhere in various schools for free as well. So it's a collaboration among all three of us, Augusta University, PRA Publishing, and then also Articoli Liberi, the Italian organization led by Frank Iodice as well.
Well, that's so great that you're promoting learning different languages and literature, and everybody should be able to understand and really grasp whatever they're reading. So I have a couple more questions about the translation process.
Yes.
Just to go into it, what is the most difficult aspect of translating literature into its non-native language?
Oh wow, there's various levels of difficulties and challenges translating into another language. The most important thing is being very familiar with both cultures, like not only linguistically speaking, but also be aware of the idioms or any cultural things that might be, important to one culture, but maybe not as important and not as present in others, or how that translates into another
Mhm.
culture as well. Another difficulty is also trying to express the same emotions in that other language, and also making the audience feel that same emotion. So that's very, very difficult when it's two different cultures with different backgrounds and different histories. And so that's I think, the most difficult aspect of translation, not just the linguistic aspect of it, but also just everything that goes behind just translating word by word, like one word or just one phrase to another phrase. So you have to keep in mind the context, the culture of the audience. You have to make sure you're not being unfaithful to the original too much, trying to convey that same meaning, that same deeper message into another culture, another language, and always keeping faithful to the original, but also keeping in mind that the target audience and the target language also has to be natural and has to make sense. It has to it doesn't have to read like a translation. It has to read like an original, and that's the hardest part of translating. Really, really making, giving that original, doing it justice, in
Yeah.
another culture.
No, that totally makes sense. And this directly goes into my next question. Do you believe
Mhm.
that literature translated still holds the same integrity as its original language? And I kind of thought of this because I remember in one of my English classes, we were reading a bunch of translations and we
Mhm.
were always asking, like, how would somebody from that culture interpret this English translation if they were fluent in both? So I was really thinking about, does that still hold up in both languages?
Well, yes, and that's the difficulty of it. Sometimes the translation becomes a new book almost. You are still being truthful to the original message and the intent, the deeper meaning of it, but it's almost like the translator, especially when it's literature and it's a novel, and you can take those liberties. You can actually modulate into the other language. You can omit and add things to
Mhm.
make it sound more natural, or also to give a little bit more information if needed. If the other culture is not aware of certain things, you maybe add some. So a literary translator can do that. When it's a technical medical kind of translation, then you can't obviously do that. But with literary translations, the translator almost becomes the new author of the book, keeping in mind the original. It's like the text is the source, and you're giving it life into another culture. And
Mhm.
many times it works, and it does remain, for the most part, faithful to the original. But then this book could also lead up to other kinds of interpretation, depending on the audience as well. I'm not sure if that makes sense. So it's almost like it's a new book that can open up new interpretations,
Mhm.
because another culture and another language is going to interpret it also in different ways. But if you keep in mind that each reader, anyways, even when you're reading the original in English, let's say,
Mhm.
each reader gives another meaning to that text. It can be interpreted so many ways. So
True.
it takes a life of its own. So no single reader is going to read the book the same way. Even if you read it twice, the second time around it gives another meaning. So translation is another level of that. It is transferring that information into another culture and language, and then that can be interpreted into so many ways. And as long as you are conveying that same kind of original meaning that it wanted to, or some of the emotions that this book conveys in the original, then you've done a good job. As
Yeah,
long as you're not being completely untruthful to the original, then it's good. But then again, it can lead to various different interpretations as well. It's a different book,
N-
basically.
no, that's the most interesting thing I've ever heard about translation, that even in English, when two different people read it, they can have two different ideas. So
Right.
the whole idea of like translation not being true, I mean, that is already moot in itself, when in the same language, people can have different interpretations of everything. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Yes, exactly. No, no, yeah, and even the intent of the author might have been different than what the reader then reads and finds other levels of interpretations. There's so many different levels, so many
Mhm.
nuances that also that's also the hardest part, the nuances of the original, to be able to translate that. But again, the translator has to be creative enough
Mhm.
and talented enough and know of the culture enough and the language enough to be able to play with those nuances and convey them again in another language.
Totally. And
Yeah.
then this goes into my last question is,
Mhm.
how often do you find yourself referencing or reflecting on English literary devices while translating a piece into Spanish? Is there anything particularly different between Spanish and English literary devices, for example, like the function of a metaphor or imagery in a sentence?
Well, yeah, that's the hardest part, especially, well, in the case of poetry also, that's got to be the most complicated
Yeah.
part. Because metaphors, sometimes there's different, we don't use the same type of imagery to
Mhm.
convey something in another language, or we associate colors differently from
Mhm.
one culture to the next.
Yeah.
And sometimes something as simple as the color red can convey a certain image in one language and then maybe another. So sometimes you have to translate the color correctly, and it might not be red, it might be some other color,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. So or sound or smell or anything like that, you really have to be able to, that's why you have to know the culture that you're translating into,
Yeah.
because you have to know what conveys that meaning in that other culture, that not necessarily is that color or is that image or is that, that sound or anything like that. So poetry is very, very hard because of that, but also just literature in general. Metaphors can't be translated literally.
Mhm.
Idioms cannot be translated literally word for word. You have to find the corresponding one, and sometimes there's actually things that can be considered untranslatable.
Mhm.
It's impossible to translate, and so the translator has to have the ability to find something else as close as possible to be able to also fill in that gap of the untranslatability, and make it so that that's why many times it's new book, because you're adding other images and things. So yeah, idioms, metaphors, all of those, the folklore of it all of those things, constantly when you're translating, you're always thinking about that thing. So it's not just the surface, it's just not just the grammar and the vocabulary, it's so much more, much more complicated. And that's what I teach my students to, because many times, even if they're fully bilingual, there is a habit for people to just, you give them something to translate, they start the sentence and they start writing it down and translating it right away. And that's a big no-no.
Yeah.
First, you have to read the entire thing, really understand it, read it at least 3 times. And then once you understand the deep meaning, then you can go ahead and translate. And many times you have to distance yourself from that language and think in the other, and think culturally what would make sense. And then linguistically, what would make sense, like this, the structure of the sentence, but also the content of it.
Mhm.
So very complicated.
Yeah, that's a big job.
Yeah, it
And
is.
yeah.
It's more, it's harder than what it seems many times, because even when you're fully bilingual, you can say, oh, I can translate that. Yeah, sure. I speak both languages really well, but that's not necessarily the case. Not everybody can be a translator without having the actual proper training for it, because there's a lot more levels than just being able to translate one sentence to another
Mhm.
linguistically.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for meeting with me. And also, thank you so much with all of your work you're doing with PRA Publishing. And Do you know, this is just a kind of toss away question, like, do you know what date this would possibly be available for the English readers?
For the English readers, well, we this is a semester-long project, and their first draft is going to be due March 16th. And then, yeah, so we'll be working on that first draft and doing a lot of editing work. They have various workshops. So
Mhm.
other students, we're going to be sharing their translations. They're going to be looking at other students' translations, etc. And then by the end of the semester, around April, is when the final one is going to be due, the final draft. And then after that, it gets reviewed thoroughly again by me, the whole thing.
Mhm.
And then once I review everything, the final draft, I send it over to PRA Publishing, and then they take over after that. So I'm not sure
Mhm.
how long it takes them to get that going and published, but the actual manuscript that will be ready to get published will be ready by the beginning of May at the latest. And then after that, hopefully, I'm not sure, PRA Publishing probably would have a better idea of how the timeline works for that, but hopefully soon.
Yeah, hopefully. Well, thank you.
Hopefully.
So that's so exciting. Thank you
Yeah,
so
thank,
much
thank you.
for everything. And to hear more about Giada's work and other amazing authors published by PRA, check out the small virtual fair that supports small publishing companies like PRA Publishing. The festival will be running March 19th through 26th, and all links to the festival will be posted on their socials as well as ours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Bye.